I've been in a few times with him, and I was in at one point. The first time we met, I was in to do a transatlantic podcast in Scotland. That was fun.
Oh, the BBC thing.
No, it wasn't actually BBC. It was just two guys with a podcast.
Okay.
So, Jeremy, are you assistant professor?
Assistant professor of history and director of the Institute of Politics.
Okay.
I could just show you my new business card, and then you could read it. Okay. Director of Institute of Politics. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
History and political science?
I'm just an assistant professor of history. Yeah. And don't worry about the department name because it's getting changed. Sure. And now I can hear myself.
Hello, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yep, I can hear it.
Got it. We looking okay?
You're on.
We're on. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody. Bob Oxley here. It's time for tips, topics, issues, and positions. And today we want to welcome back to our studio here at TIPS Dr. Jeremy Young, who is a assistant professor of history, as well as the director of the Institute of Politics here at Dixie State University. Welcome back, Dr. Young.
Thanks. It's good to be here again.
Right. I've got a very active agenda here for us to take a look at. We're going to talk, the topic is the Utah State Legislative Session 2019, and there's a lot of topics here that we want to take a look at and issues that we'd love to have your opinion. That's what we're all about here at TIPS. So do you want to get started?
Sure.
All right. I'm just going to throw out overall topics, and we can talk specifics about different bills that were considered and what the governors Herbert signed or not signed, or what got hung up in committee, that type of thing. So
sure.
The first general topic that I want to talk about for the 2019 session for the Utah State Legislature is health care. All right.
Big topic.
It is a big topic. I guess the big one that we really want to find out about, my listeners have already requested that you use your expertise so they can understand it, is that Medicaid expansion program, the revisions. And can you give us some insight on that? What is it? Where did it go? Has it been signed? Is it going to be signed? Any changes? Anything like that?
Sure. So as I think we mentioned the last time I was on the show, the voters passed in November a an initiative or a referendum that would have expanded Medicaid coverage through the provisions of Obamacare. Now, the legislature was concerned, and there's been some disagreement in the past over that question between legislators and between the legislators and the governor, who's been fairly supportive of expanding Medicaid. But there was some concern among legislators that the bill as passed was going to bankrupt the state in the long term. That it was going to lead to state payments for Medicaid that would exceed what the tax base could provide. And so the legislature ended up passing a bill that would expand Medicaid, but that would tie it to first of all, that would change the amount that it was expanded less than the proposition had requested to save some money for the state. And second, there was a lot of support within the legislature and from the governor for tying Medicaid to a work requirement. So essentially, you can't get Medicaid unless you're working within a certain amount of time after you apply. And there's political arguments about whether that's the way to go, but the biggest concern among supporters of the expansion was that Obamacare, as currently written, doesn't allow for that requirement to be in place. So the federal government has been, under President Trump, has been trying to provide waivers for states that want to do it that way. So far, those waivers have been struck down in lower courts as violating the Obamacare law, the Affordable Health Care Act. And the Trump administration and I think the legislators and the governor believe or hope that the ability to issue a waiver like that will eventually be upheld by the Supreme Court, in which case the expansion would go into force in this sort of lesser form with a requirement for work. If the Supreme Court either doesn't uphold the ability to give a waiver, or if the administration for some reason doesn't provide one to Utah, then it would essentially not go into effect. If in that case, the legislature would have to consider the question again next year. Wow.
Here we go again, right? Possibly.
Never ends.
It never ends is right. I'm looking here at under healthcare also. Healthcare charges. This is create a healthcare price transparency tool. Do you know anything about that?
I think that's one of the bills that was passed fairly unanimously by the legislature. I think that it was, or at least by an overwhelming margin, I think that it was more of a technical question related to how pricing for healthcare is provided, and I don't think that one was made as many headlines. Probably a sort of routine good government bill.
Got it. I got one more for you under healthcare.
Sure.
I'm loaded today for you. This one here is interesting because of the cost of prescription medication. This actually was a bill. It says the Prescription Drug Importation Program, and it's to create a state-run program to import pharmaceuticals directly from Canada. What happened with that one?
So this is something that states have been pursuing, and it does seem to be legal for states to do it and legal for the federal government to do it, although they haven't been doing it, and it's been a topic of discussion. Essentially, drugs, for a variety of reasons, are more expensive when purchased in the United States than they are in other countries. Now, there's always some concern among medical professionals that those drugs purchased in other countries might not meet American safety standards. But when the other country is Canada, there's a pretty good sense that those drugs do meet safety standards, and the state being able to purchase drugs from Canada, or state health providers, or even the insurance being able to negotiate situations like that saves a lot of money, both for the insurance and ultimately for the consumer. So Utah's joined a lot of other states in greenlighting that.
Okay, let me ask you a question about that, though. Is it the reason that the same prescription drugs are lesser costly to the patients in Canada as compared to us, even though they're negotiated with the same pharmaceutical company that's making the same drug? Is it because of the government of Canada does the negotiating? Is that?
So I'm trying to remember now what the reason is for that difference. I think that it has that the prices are more tightly regulated in Canada. I think that Some of it has to do with the private insurance model in the United States and the Medicare model, both of which, so Medicare does not currently allow Medicare itself as an insurance company to negotiate with drug companies to set prices. So essentially the drug company can charge whatever they want to charge, and Medicare is simply required to cover it. And because Medicare covers a lot of Americans, although albeit entirely elderly Americans, it allows the drug companies to raise prices a lot. The price of a drug is essentially determined by the drug company in the United States, without there being anyone who can negotiate with it, whether the government, whether the insurance company. And I think that is not the case in Canada, and that's the reason for the difference.
Okay. I've got another question for you along the same line. Sometime last year, this is outside of the legislature, but I'm sure they approved it, I think. It was released, there was a press release that came out that said if you were a public employee in the state of Utah, that you had an option that the government would reimburse you, if you were a public employee, reimburse you to go to Mexico to get certain medical treatments. And they did their calculations, and they found out it's cheaper to pay for your flight to Mexico and the cost of the medical treatment than it is to stay here and go locally.
Right.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Am I right? Did that pass? Is that in effect? Or?
I think I've heard of people who've been offered that by their insurance companies to go to. Not sure if those people are in Utah, but I have heard of that. And again, there's some question about whether the process of certifying medical procedures is entirely safe in Mexico, but it is for certain procedures. And so if the procedure is safe and the insurance company determines that it's much cheaper to fly someone to Mexico for care than to have them get care in the United States, then that's what they're trying to do. So it's really the same question that's involved with that policy.
Yeah, so it's North America, Canada for the prescriptions, and Mexico for actual procedures.
Yes.
So that's real. Okay.
Yes, I think that the real takeaway here is that there are parts of the U.S. healthcare system that nobody likes. There are parts that are controversial, and there are parts that are broadly popular, and there are parts that nobody likes. And one of those parts is the fact that everything is so expensive in the United States. And so this is a federal government problem. It is expensive for federal reasons. It doesn't really have much to do with Utah. And so what Utah is doing is trying to handle the problem at a state level by allowing providers and insurers and consumers to shop around rather than waiting for the federal government to offer a solution. It really doesn't look like the federal government is close to offering any kind of solution to any healthcare problem right now, given that control of Congress is divided between the two parties. So this is a Utah stopgap, and it's a stopgap a lot of other states are engaging in as well.
All right, great. Which we know that President Trump, just to throw this in, made a statement yesterday that the Affordable Care Act will be no longer, as long he's going to push for that to eliminate that.
Right.
And I understand that some of his Republican colleagues have indicated we don't have anything to replace it with. So
right, and there's two problems there. One, that Republicans can't agree among themselves what a replacement would look like, and two, that they don't control all of Congress at this point. So it seems very unlikely that any kind of healthcare plan of any type would pass in the next 2 years.
Okay, great. Okay, can we change topics now?
Sure.
You did a great job with healthcare. How about air quality? Especially here in Utah, up in around Salt Lake City, with the inversion problem, and we had alerts, we had orange levels and critical red levels, and
right.
One of the things that one of the proposals was that there was a vehicle emissions reduction program, and it said that it would reduce the emissions by retiring the dirtiest failing cars on the road.
Right.
Wow.
So this is an easy way to reduce emissions because there are cars on the emission standards have been consistently tightened, especially since the 1990s. But starting in the 1960s, there are a lot of vehicles on the road from before then, but there are still a lot of vehicles on the road from before the 1990s. And some of them are trucks, some of them are things that are very expensive, so you keep them working for a very long time. And those vehicles emit 10, 20 times as much carbon dioxide and other problematic gases as modern vehicles do in the U.S. And so simply convincing Americans to get rid of those vehicles and replace them with more modern vehicles it would have a really significant effect on the environment. The problem is that costs the average consumer money to go sell their car that they have. All those cars are paid off. They've been around for 20, 30 years. And so the government would provide an incentive under this plan to do that. The government would essentially pay people to turn in their cars and replace them with newer cars. And this is a policy that governments have been supportive of in the United States for a long time. There was a Cash for Clunkers program in the stimulus bill in 2009 that did a very similar thing to this, and it was the same idea. The difficulty is just money. Does a federal government or a state government have enough money to do it? And so the air quality discussion began this legislative session with the governor in his State of the State address calling on the legislature to spend $100 million to improve air quality. And that was a big ask. The state doesn't have an enormous budget. It would be a huge chunk of the budget. And they didn't get there. They didn't get to $100 million, but they did get to $28 million increase in spending on air quality. And this was a big part of that. This was one of the components of that plan.
Wow, interesting. We're staying with air quality. Another one of the proposals was to the Environmental Quality Monitoring Amendment directs the DEQ to monitor and report environment impacts of the inland port development.
So the inland port development, this is it's kind of a misleading name. It's not actually a port. Of course, the only large body of water around where it would be developed is the Great Salt Lake. There's not going to be a lot of boating on the Great Salt Lake anytime soon. But that's where they come up with the name. Basically, it's a large industrial and commercial development that is being proposed for Salt Lake City, and there are a lot of concerns among environmental quality groups about the environmental impact of it. As you know, Salt Lake City has a massive inversion problem with smog that is among the worst of any city in the country,
yes,
particularly during certain seasons. And so the port, the idea of this development is that it would provide a lot of economic benefit for the region, but it might also really cause problems for the air quality, which is beginning to be a major health concern in that area and is getting worse. And so again, they're cleaning up the inversion, cleaning up the air in Salt Lake City would be very expensive, and the legislature didn't appropriate enough money to completely solve the problem, which would be a lot of money. But this is the first step. They appropriated money to simply study the question of whether this development would create pollution problems, and then potentially to try to remediate that before it would be fully completed.
Okay, so they're kind of covering themselves a little bit on that one, right?
Covering themselves, but also I think studying a problem is never a bad idea before you pass legislation to deal with it. There's essentially a lot of dispute between the advocates of the inland port and climate activists over just how much pollution it would cause, and so studying it would be a good way to resolve that dispute. But I think before proceeding.
And there's a lot of controversy along with it, how to proceed on. There's a lot of different viewpoints.
Right. It's hard to say no to a development that's going to create jobs, but at the same time, it's hard to say yes to a development that's going to make people feel sick. So there needs to be a way to balance those concerns, and I think that's what the legislature was trying to do here.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks. You ready to change your topic?
Sure.
Let's go to education now.
Yes.
We're moving right through this state legislature session. They should listen to us. We move through all these things pretty rapidly.
Well, it's easy for us to talk about it once they've worked on it for 45 days. They put in a lot of work.
That's true. This one here under education, it says health education amendments, and this is provides that health education instruction may include information about contraception. And
this is on the list. I'm trying to look at your list here to see what the outcome of this amendment was. This is a bill that passed, correct?
Yeah.
Right. So I think that this was a sort of small change in some ways to the way that health education and sex education is conducted in the state of Utah. These have been subjects of a lot of controversy for a long time, not just in Utah but in other states, as to whether education programs should teach sexual health at all, whether they should be abstinence only, whether they should discuss contraception, whether they should be what's so-called comprehensive sex education that includes discussion of social systems and relationship practices and things of that sort. And I think that the purpose of this bill was to, and I actually didn't realize it had passed until you mentioned that, was to, I guess I would say, return some local control over that question to individual schools and school districts and teachers, so that that can be determined at a more local level rather than simply banning the discussion of contraception at a state level. So I think that's what was done.
All right. Here's another one for you. It's the Education Accountability Amendments, and this one I'm sure is because you're in education. So here we go. It says yeah, I know. Removes the single letter grade from school evaluations in favor of a dashboard system.
A dashboard system. That's interesting.
It is.
So I think the idea is to provide a more nuanced system for evaluating school children at the K through 12 levels, so that rather than simply using the letter grade system, which a lot of we still use it even in higher education, but we also increasingly add it to other things. People use terms like satisfactory, unsatisfactory, needs work. We use a point system very often. That's not the way this used to be done 50 years ago. It was just the letter, but now there's a point system out of 100 sometimes, or other points. And I think this is a way of providing more flexibility on those grounds as well.
Okay, so it's giving them the flexibility necessary, and it's really going to be, is it left up, do you think it's going to be left up to the districts themselves to make the determination if there's going to be any changes?
I think that's probably the case, yes.
Okay, all right. I'm going to move right on to strengthening families. We're moving.
Well, that's always a good thing. We like that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, but here's one that it says family medical unpaid leave provisions, and it's SB 110. It says requires certain employers to provide at least 3 weeks of unpaid leave to certain employees.
Right. Yes. This one I've been tracking for a while.
Okay.
The name is it's one of those names that is, people like to call their bills the Good Government Act, right? What are you going to, if you vote against it, what are you going to say to your constituents? I voted against good government. So, yeah, strengthening families. So this is a bill that allows or requires actually employers, as you said, to provide at least 3 weeks of unpaid leave to all workers after the birth of a child. And so that is, again, there's a lot of discussion and argument about unpaid leave or paid family leave. In European countries, it's traditional for there to be as much as a year and a half of paid leave for both parents. Some countries have that. In the United States, there's been a lot of pushback against that approach by corporations who argue that would really significantly hurt their bottom line. The state of California recently passed, or actually didn't pass, but Governor Newsom proposed a family leave plan that would provide 6 weeks of, actually I think 6 months of paid leave for both parents, and that would be by far the most paid leave that's mandated in any state in the United States. And of course, any employer can provide more paid or unpaid leave if they want to. This is about setting a minimum requirement. And so, especially since that proposal came through from Governor Newsom in California, there's been a push to do similar things in other states. And as usual in Utah, this is a baby step, right? Utah legislators tend to believe in gradualism and gradual approaches to things, and so this is moving simply to the point where you can require an employer to let parents take 3 weeks if they don't have to pay them. You're not going to get a lot of opposition from employers for that because it doesn't really affect their pocketbook. They're just without an employee for 3 weeks. And most employers probably already do something similar to that, and so there's not going to be a lot of opposition to that. But as far as paid leave, which is where the real fight is, or longer periods of leave, that's very much still an open question and not part of this bill.
And it is for both parents. It's not gender. It's not male, female.
Right, and that's what the push is for, to make this leave for both parents to take. And I think that this bill, again, is a beginning in that direction.
Okay, fantastic. I've got something here under good government, and we're talking about straight ticket voting prohibition amendments.
Right.
And it says removes straight ticket party voting and requires voting for the candidates on a ballot individually. Is that a big deal?
It does tend to have a large effect because so essentially if you're certain that you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, it makes it easier for you to go in and check a box that says I want to vote for all the Democrats, and then you might still end up voting on things like judicial election or retention elections or bills, measures that are being proposed, but you're going to just vote for all of the partisan candidates in a particular party. And on the one hand, that tends to improve turnout on certain races. If you're candidates who are running for county assessor like that option, because then they actually get votes, and sometimes they don't get votes otherwise. And on the other hand, it decreases the chance of people splitting their ticket and voting for one Democrat along with the other Republicans, or one Republican along with the other Democrats. So good government advocates have had a lot of different positions on this. I think that the idea that straight ticket voting hurts local candidates is valid, but I also think it's important to allow and encourage people to think openly about who they're going to support for each and every race. So that's what this bill does. It takes that option away and makes it so that each race is something that voters decide directly, no matter what.
That's great. Listen, we're going to take a break now, but don't go away. We're going to be right back after these messages. This is Bob Oxley for Tips, and coming back and listening to some more great opinions and expertise from our guest, Dr. Jeremy Young from Dixie State University. We'll be right back. Goodbye now. Welcome back. Here we are again, Tips, and Dr. Jeremy Young's ready to take on some more questions concerning our Utah 2019 legislative session. And Dr. Young, here we go. We don't stop, do we? There was a lot of activity, wasn't there?
Yes, it was a very busy session, I think.
Yeah. Here's one for you. This is some of the other bills. The Bureau of Criminal Identification Reporting Amendment. It says requires reporting of people deemed by a court to be mentally unfit to purchase a firearm.
Right. So this was a bill that made it so that if a court has declared people to be unfit to purchase a firearm for reasons of mental health distress, that decision has to be reported to other law enforcement agencies and to gun dealers so that it can be made known. So it's again a kind of a routine good government bill. It's not there's no real opposition to this even from gun manufacturers. If the state is already saying that someone can't buy a gun, there's no reason for that information not to be made known to the people who would actually sell the guns.
Right. And that probably is a response to some of the mass shootings recently.
Right, and a lot of these gun bills were in response to the murder of Lauren McCluskey at the University of Utah by an ex-boyfriend who had a gun in his possession, who had significant mental distress and had a gun in his possession that wasn't his, that someone else had lent him. And so that led to a variety of bills on gun control in the legislature, none of which passed except for this one. This one was pretty uncontroversial, but the others, there were people who wanted to make it a felony to lend someone a gun, who wanted to, there were more traditional liberal bills such as banning certain types of guns from being sold entirely, and then there was also a bill that went the other way that was proposed that would have stated that Utah didn't that Utah was completely against any further gun regulations, and none of those passed. The only ones that passed were this one you mentioned, and also a bill that essentially stated Utah is happy with its gun laws as they are, which is about as uncontroversial as you can get. Right?
That's
Our laws are good laws. That's get people to vote for that. That's like getting people to vote for naming a post office, right? Nobody's really going to object to that.
There you go. Great. I got another one for you. How about this one? Water Conservation Plan Amendments. This requires water retailers to evaluate how to conserve and cost of not conserving.
Another sort of routine good government bill. This is designed to make, basically to make, if you're a person who sells water, if you're a company that sells water, you should make sure that the water you're selling is being used. You should make sure that your water lines aren't leaking. You should make sure that you're not selling someone 1,000 gallons of water and they only use 500 and then the rest just gets dumped into the soil. You need to make efforts to conserve the water that isn't being used by anyone else that you've sold or that you're trying to sell.
Okay, great. Here we go for another one. This one here was very controversial. Abortion amendments.
Right.
Prohibits abortion of a fetus at 18 weeks.
So the current Utah law prohibits abortion of a fetus, I believe, at 20 weeks, and this bill would have reduced it to 18. Now, federally, Roe versus Wade draws that line at 24 weeks. So bills that draw it lower have generally been viewed as unconstitutional by the courts. However, the Supreme Court has recently changed its composition, and there's some thought that some of these abortion provisions may be in question now, and that the new laws restricting abortion might be upheld by the new court with Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh on the court, replacing two other justices. And so this is a bill that the Utah legislature passed to try to restrict abortion access in essentially the middle trimester, to restrict it to only 18 weeks after conception. And it's going. The bill. Well, first of all, the bill was, had it taken effect, was going to be immediately challenged in court by the ACLU, and then it would have probably joined a bunch of other bills in other states that have similar purposes, and they would have all traveled together over the next few years up the court system to the Supreme Court. However, in this case, the governor vetoed the bill. This is the only major veto that the governor issued this year. He said that even though he's pro-life, that he didn't think that he thought this bill was essentially a waste of time for the state because it was going to be a lot of litigation, and the state would end up getting the same restriction anyway if Roe v. Wade was changed at the Supreme Court, just because other states are challenging it. And the legislature has been talking about trying to reconvene and override the veto, but it's not entirely clear that they have the votes in the Senate. So that's still an ongoing question.
Okay, great. It was controversial. Thanks for that update on the governor. Here's another one for you. It's the Utah Vital Statistics Act amendments, and it says prohibits a change of gender on a person's birth certificate.
Right. So this is a bill. Okay. So now that you've gotten to this one, this is a bill that I know didn't pass. So I think that some of the other ones we've talked about may not have passed either.
Yeah.
Actually,
I just
this is a tracking list of bills that were under consideration.
Right.
So just to look back through the list to make sure I don't get that wrong. All the Medicare ones passed. I think a lot of these that we discussed did pass. I'm not sure about the health education. I don't believe the health education benefit amendment did pass that we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
The straight ticket voting, I'm not sure about that one. I think it didn't pass either. So to go back to the one you asked me about, the
Utah Vital Statistics
Right,
Act amendments.
Right. So the Vital Statistics Act amendments. This was a bill that was proposed to prohibit Southern Utah legislators from. I don't know where that came from. A bill that was because the person who proposed it was a Southern Utah legislator. That's what I was thinking about. It was proposed to prohibit transgender individuals from changing their name on their birth certificate to a name that matches their gender. And the bill was not considered. It died in committee. It did not make it to the floor.
Okay, but it was considered there.
Right.
Okay. Here's another one. Down syndrome non-discrimination abortion act.
Right. This one did pass. This was another abortion bill that made it illegal to have an abortion simply for the purpose of aborting a child with Down syndrome, a fetus with Down syndrome. And this passed overwhelmingly, and the governor did sign this one into law. Okay. Again, this one is not currently viewed as constitutional, but there's some thought that the Supreme Court might uphold it at a later time.
Okay. I've got another one here. It's universal background checks for firearm purchasers. The bill requires a background check for all firearm sales, which I thought was already a law here, but obviously it wasn't.
Right. It's not, universal background checks is not a federal law or a state law, and this is another provision on gun control that didn't pass.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how about Tax Equalization and Reduction Act? And it says decreases sales and income taxes, expands sales taxes to certain services.
So the governor proposed a pretty large realignment of taxes in the state, and the purpose of this realignment is that the state has restrictions on what income tax can be used for and on what sales tax can be used for, and the governor's concern was that given those restrictions, there's too much money coming in from income tax and not enough coming in from sales tax to meet the needs as they develop in those areas. So his proposal was to change the tax program to essentially cut income taxes and raise sales taxes to meet those different needs, and potentially also to change some of the categories in which those taxes could fall. And ultimately, the governor proposed this, and it didn't seem as though the legislature was prepared to act on it right away. It was it would have been probably the biggest bill passed, the most transformative bill passed for the state if it had gone through, and they wanted more time to talk about it. They wanted more time to study it. So it became clear by the end of the session it wasn't going to pass this session. And so then there was a proposal on the floor to essentially not fund a large portion of the budget without this passing. And ultimately what was decided was to just fund the budget as is, but to then potentially hold a special session in the summer to reconsider the tax bill after legislators have been able to talk to their constituents about it. So ultimately what happened here was no action, and probably action will be taken at a later time.
Okay. Is this a response to a large surplus that the state of Utah has realized, and some of the pushback on this proposal was because, wait a minute, was supposed to be a sales tax or a tax reduction, and now you're trying to tax other services? And can you explain why are we having this controversy if we have a surplus?
So the surplus was an income tax surplus, and according to the state law, income tax has to be spent primarily on education. And while there's certainly arguments that education needs more funding in Utah. Utah lags at the very end of state rankings as far as education funding. The amount of money that was in there, the legislature and the governor felt was way too much, and also not sustainable. Not money that was going to come in year after year, just money that had come in a particular year. And so if you want to do things like build roads, if you want to do things like develop social policies and fund them, things like the air quality bill, that has to be funded out of sales tax according to the state constitution. So the goal was to decrease the income tax to keep those surplus, basically to keep the same amount of tax coming in, but have it come in through sales tax so it could be used for those other purposes as well. As part of the compromise that ended up in no action immediately on this, a big chunk of that surplus was spent on education as a sort of one-time windfall. And so there was a pretty strong increase in education funding this year, although it won't be a permanent thing.
Okay, so that was a response to the. Correct me if I'm wrong. If it wasn't the government, the governor's concern and some of his colleagues' concern is that, like you said, long-term spreading this surplus. In other words, ensuring that real life revenue streams would continue to come in to offset, and that's why they proposed some new taxes to new services just to maintain that.
I think that's part of it, yes, and part of of why this is so controversial is that there is some criticism of sales taxes by groups on the left who argue that sales taxes are essentially what we call regressive taxes, that the income tax is a progressive tax, meaning that as you make more money over the course of the year, you pay not only a higher amount of money, but at a higher rate. So you pay a higher percentage of your income in income tax the larger your income is, the more you can afford it, essentially. Whereas a sales tax, everyone pays the same amount on a sales tax. So if the amount of groceries that I have to buy and the amount of groceries that a billionaire has to buy are not that different. And they may be a little different. Maybe the billionaire buys slightly more expensive groceries, but not a million times more expensive groceries. And so we pay essentially the same sales tax even though we have different incomes. And so increasing the sales tax leads a higher proportion of the tax burden to fall onto poorer individuals. That said, if not increasing the sales tax means that a lot of these priorities don't get funded in the state of Utah because of the way the Constitution is written. So it's a difficult problem. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, I hear the term stratification, inequality, everything was involved in this debate.
Right.
I know the right way to go. But you mentioned that they are going to reconvene this summer in a special session. Is that correct?
That's the goal. I think it's to some degree it depends on how these meetings go between the legislators and their constituents over the next few months. But that's the plan.
Okay. Taking a look back and reflecting on the entire session itself, is there any one or two areas that you think that the legislature really moved the state of Utah forward in a very, very positive? I mean, your expertise this is your area. So, are you pleased? Is there a couple of things that the legislature came through with and voted bipartisan votes that really is moving this state forward?
Well, I think that a lot of the votes that were taken were uncontroversial, were all positive steps. I think one bill we haven't mentioned that's important to talk about is the hate crimes bill. So there was a hate crimes bill that was passed several years ago, adding so Utah has a hate crime statute, but the bill had added gender and sexual orientation to a list of things that could be considered as whether or not something is chargeable as a hate crime. But that bill essentially has been unenforceable. Prosecutors have complained that they can't effectively use it because the standard for determining whether something is or is not a hate crime is so high that they can't really convict on that. So they haven't been using it to charge people, despite the fact that the legislature intended it to be used. And so a bill that was passed this session with a lot of support was a strengthening of that hate crime provision that is now usable. So now if someone commits a hate crime against someone because of their gender or sexual orientation, they can be charged with a hate crime on top of being charged with a regular just the regular crime and potentially have a longer sentence. And again, that's the legislature fulfilling a goal that it tried to fulfill several years ago and doing it now in a usable way. I think that's an important development. I think the funding for air quality is an important development. As in many cases in Utah, it's a first step. The things move gradually, and maybe in every legislative body, but certainly here in Utah, there's a lot of support for that. And so I think those are changes that are probably going to have a positive effect.
Yeah, that inversion that they have up there, and that we don't have to suffer with here in St. George, but
Right.
up there in Salt Lake City it was so critical this year, more so than I ever remember it. The number of days that had the orange and the red, and
Right.
people with just a minor respiratory problem were directly affected by that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be fixed by anything the legislature did here, but the process has begun, and I think that's important.
That's good. And you brought up about the hate crimes bill, which was unique is that because previously we talked about one of the bills introduced about transgenders as far as birth certificate changes.
Right.
And that got put on the shelf or didn't go. But the good news is from a LGBTQ plus, that was embedded into the hate crimes bill, some positive
the
things.
bill we talked about previously was a bill that would have banned transgender individuals from changing their name on their birth certificate.
Right.
So it was a bill that was designed to limit access to services and rights for transgender individuals. There was another bill that was considered and ultimately shelved that was trying to ban conversion therapy in
Yes.
the state of Utah, and that was very controversial and ultimately, I think, it got very confusing for a lot of people. There were people in the Senate adding what seemed to be on the face of things well-meaning amendments that ended up gutting the bill, and then the original sponsor of the bill had to pull it to make sure that it didn't produce something even worse. And the governor said the governor was supportive of the original bill and then supported the changes and then decided afterwards that he'd made a mistake and he shouldn't have done that. And so all of that, the plan is that bill will be reintroduced next year and perhaps with a more favorable outcome.
Yeah. Ms. Perkins from our the MIC, the Multicultural Inclusion Center, she was on this show and she talked exclusively on that bill and
Right.
and how there was a tennis match back and forth and watered down to a point was ridiculous. So
Right,
yeah.
definitely. And I should clarify, just because we got a little off track at the beginning. I mean, I think a lot of the bills that involved social issues did not pass. The significant bills involving gun control did not pass. Significant bills involving changes to sexual education, sexual health laws, bills of those type. Some of them had more or less degrees of success. Some of them were seriously considered, others not. But for the most part, the legislature stayed out of those questions, with the exception of the hate crimes bill and the bills on abortion.
Okay. So your overall impression, was it a worthwhile legislative session in 2019? Did the state move forward, or are we still moving too slow?
I think every legislative session is a worthwhile session. I mean, I think it's if anything, it's interesting that Utah is one of those states that chooses to have a part-time legislature, because it really does seem like there's always a lot more to discuss and debate and try to pass than the legislature has time for. I think there's at some point in the future the state may want to reconsider the amount of time they dedicate to the legislative session to try to deal with these issues in a more thorough way. But I think the legislature worked pretty economically. They got through a lot of stuff in a short period of time. They postponed the biggest decision and will probably revisit it before next year. So I think a lot got done. And whether or not that's the things that got done were the right things, that's up to the individual voter, I think.
All right. Thank you so much for all of your input on that. Now I want to ask you a question, more personal note. You're the director of the Institute for Politics or of Politics?
Institute of Politics and Public Affairs
at
is the full name. Yes.
And Affairs at Dixie State University. Do you have any events coming up? I've seen you up there on the stage. You did a great job.
Thank you.
So what else have you got planned for the Institute?
So if you are, to the listeners, if you are interested in the question of what happened in the legislative session and how it all shook out, We are going to, you're going to have someone up there more knowledgeable than me answering that question. We're going to have some of our legislators from Southern Utah come to an Institute of Politics event and go through all of this again from a very knowledgeable perspective, cover what happened at the legislature, what they think were the most successful developments, things of that sort. And that's going to be April 18th, the 18th of April at noon, from noon to 1, in the Gardner Center on campus in Conference Room B.
Okay.
So April 18th, 12 to 1, Conference Room B in the Gardner Center.
So we're going to have the guys who are actually involved, everybody we were talking about today, you're going to have them right there.
Right.
What a fantastic opportunity. I'm sure you're going to have a Q&A session at the end.
We'll see. I think we're going to try to go through a lot of the bills that are there and just see what their experiences were and try to get a closing report from them on what happened.
That will be very, very interesting because their perspective, and I'm sure that they've got a lot of things went on behind the scenes. I hope they open up their kimono and let us know a little bit more about that. That'll be exciting.
You never learn more than when you talk to the people actually involved.
Absolutely.
So we welcome everyone from the Southern Utah community to come out and see that.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're about done for this tip show. And Dr. Jeremy Young, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Everything you're doing between the teaching, being a professor, as well as now you're director of the politics and director of the Institute of Politics and
Public Affairs.
I want to thank everybody for listening in. We'll be back next week. You can take a look at, listen to us at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoons and rebroadcast at 5 p.m. on Saturdays. Or you can take a look at the handsome face of Dr. Jeremy Young on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as well as Alexis. So until next week, this is Bob Oxley for Tips, Topics, Issues, and Positions, signing off, and have a great day.